The tab has been open for 11 days, not because the information inside it changed, but because closing it would mean accepting what the information already says. You have read the same article 3 times. You have rewritten the list of pros and cons twice, and the second version reached the same conclusion as the first. So you adjusted the phrasing slightly and called it a new list. Nothing new has arrived. No fact has shifted the weight of the evidence. What you are looking for at this point is not an answer. It is an answer that costs less than the one you already have. Introduction. There is a difference between thinking that moves and thinking that circles. Thinking that moves brings you to a consideration you had not previously held, changes the weight of something you thought you understood, or reveals a consequence you had not accounted for. Thinking that circles brings you back to the same question with the same evidence and produces the same provisional conclusion, except that producing it again feels temporarily more bearable than acting on it. The two processes can look identical from outside. They feel nearly identical from inside. The distinction between them is not in the quality of the reasoning, but in what the reasoning is being protected from. Every prolonged decision carries a price tag that rarely appears on the list of pros and cons. It is not the price of the wrong choice. It is the price of the correct one. The answer most likely to be true requires something: a loss accepted, a conflict initiated, a responsibility claimed, an identity revised. As long as the thinking continues, that price stays in the future. The delay is not carelessness. For most people caught in it, the delay is careful, earnest, and exhausting. It is effort directed not toward clarity, but toward the discovery of an exit from the cost. This manual is called the Delay Index. It is not a system for generating faster decisions, and it does not promise that the answer forming in the evidence is the right one in any final or infallible sense. What it offers is a set of stop conditions, cost categories, and decision thresholds designed to help a serious adult distinguish genuine inquiry from protective postponement. By the time this index closes, the goal is not certainty. The goal is a proportionate first step taken on the best available evidence, with the cost acknowledged and the revision criteria already written down. The central question this index holds open is worth naming plainly. How can you know when more thinking is producing clarity and when it is simply protecting you from the price of the answer already forming? That question will not be answered in the first section. It will be answered section by section, distinction by distinction. As each form of delay becomes legible and each form of legitimate inquiry receives its own conditions, what matters now is that the question is real, that you are holding it honestly, and that the tab is still open. Chapter 1. When thought stops moving, information capable of changing a conclusion has specific characteristics. It introduces a fact not previously available, a consequence not previously considered, or a perspective that materially reorders the weight of existing evidence. A contract reviewed by a lawyer that reveals an undisclosed liability is new information. A medical test result that changes the risk profile of a treatment is new information. A conversation with a person directly affected by the decision that reveals needs or objections not previously understood is new information. The distinguishing feature is not that the information feels important or that it generates strong emotion, but that, upon reflection, it would alter what a reasonable person would do next. Consider what that standard excludes. A third reading of the same article does not produce new information, even if the third reading feels more careful than the second. A different framing of a consequence you have already weighed does not produce new information unless it exposes something materially different about that consequence. A new conversation that confirms what 2 previous conversations already established does not produce new information. It produces social repetition. None of this means the reading, the reframing, or the conversation was useless. It means that after a point, the function of these activities shifts from information gathering to something else. That something else becomes visible when you compare what you believed before the research cycle began with what you believe after several weeks of sustained inquiry. In many cases of genuine research, the belief changes substantially. In many cases of protective delay, the belief barely moves, or it moves slightly in response to emotional pressure and then returns to roughly the same position. The returning is the signal. When the evidence consistently produces a provisional conclusion, and the thinking consistently returns to re-examine the same evidence without altering the conclusion. The question worth asking is not what the evidence means, but why the conclusion remains unacceptable. Circular inquiry can begin at any point in a decision process. It is not a sign of intellectual failure. Highly analytical people often mistake its early symptoms for rigor. They believe that the loop is a sign of appropriate caution, that returning to the same question means the question deserves more scrutiny, that the discomfort of repeated return is the feeling of intellectual honesty rather than the feeling of avoidance. That belief is sometimes correct. Its correctness can be tested. The test will appear later in this index. For now, the important observation is that the loop exists and that it has a function beyond clarity. The same questions return at consistent intervals, not because new evidence has reopened them, but because the previous answer was reached and then set aside. You arrive at a provisional conclusion, hold it briefly, sense the cost attached to it, and move the inquiry one step backward to a question that feels unresolved. The motion backward feels like intellectual caution. From inside, it is almost indistinguishable from genuine reconsideration. From outside, or from a later vantage point, once the pattern becomes visible, it reads as the same circuit traveled again. One reliable marker of circular inquiry is the absence of an evidence threshold. An evidence threshold is a stated condition. If this fact is confirmed, this conclusion follows. If that document shows this, the alternative becomes untenable. A person engaged in genuine research can usually articulate, at least approximately, what evidence would change their conclusion and in which direction. A person in protective delay typically cannot. The next piece of information that would settle the matter keeps shifting. Once one threshold is crossed, another appears. The question is never quite answerable with the currently available material, because the function of the question is not to be answered. There is a temporary relief that comes from postponement, and this relief is part of what sustains the loop. The decision is not made, which means the cost is not yet real, which means this particular moment is livable. The relief is genuine. It is not self-deception in any simple sense. It is a rational short-term response to a situation in which every available path involves accepting something painful. Understanding this does not eliminate the relief. It changes what the relief signals. When the relief from not deciding becomes a primary reason for continued inquiry, the inquiry has changed function. Decision displacement is what happens when the energy that would otherwise go toward a specific decision is redirected toward adjacent, easier decisions. The research expands to cover related questions that feel relevant, but do not actually change the central answer. Peripheral planning intensifies. The person becomes busy with the geography of the decision rather than the decision itself. A life choice involving a relationship generates intensive research into logistics, finances, housing, scheduling, and secondary effects, all of which are legitimate considerations, while the primary question of whether the relationship meets the minimum conditions for continuation goes unexamined. The displacement is not obvious even to the person inside it. Research has a texture of productivity. Hours spent reading, comparing, analyzing, and organizing feel like forward motion. There is something created at the end of a research session, notes, summaries, updated lists, that can be pointed to as evidence of work. This texture is one reason protective delay is so easy to sustain. A person who has not yet made a difficult decision can still feel at the end of each day that they are working on it. The working on it feeling is real. The question is what the work is actually doing. In most cases of prolonged delay, the specific action being postponed is identifiable. There is a conversation that has not happened, a document that has not been submitted, a call that has not been made, an appointment that has not been scheduled. These actions are not postponed because more research is needed before they become possible. They are postponed because taking them would make the decision partially real. Initiating a legal consultation makes the possibility of legal action concrete. Scheduling a medical appointment makes the health question concrete. Having the conversation with the other person removes the option of proceeding as if the question is still purely internal. The research continues in part because the research does not carry that concreteness. There is a category difference between gathering information and accepting exposure. Information gathering is a cognitive activity that remains under the researcher's control. Exposure is what happens when the decision touches another person, an institution, or a structure that then responds in ways that cannot be managed. Research produces knowledge, exposure produces consequences. Someone caught in protective delay is usually willing to continue gathering information indefinitely, but resistant to the moment of exposure, because exposure is when the cost becomes non-hypothetical. As long as the thinking continues, the cost remains in the future. The relationship question is still open, which means both futures, the one where it continues and the one where it ends, still coexist as possibilities. The professional change has not happened, so the identity tied to the current role has not yet been released. The confrontation has not occurred, so the other person has not yet reacted. The decision exists in a suspended state that allows all possibilities to remain technically alive. Thought in this configuration does not produce clarity. It produces an ongoing condition in which clarity is never quite sufficient to justify the next concrete step. The behavioral evidence of this pattern is what this index turns to next. The question of whether thought is moving or circling is not answered by examining the quality of the thought alone. It is answered by examining what the thought is reliably not producing, what conversations keep not happening, what steps keep not being taken, and what specific cost keeps remaining safely in the future. The shift from internal analysis to behavioral observation is not a retreat from rigor. It is an extension of it. Chapter 2. The answer in your behavior, the call that keeps being pushed to tomorrow, the document that has been drafted but not sent, the appointment that has been identified but not booked, the conversation that has been rehearsed internally many times but that has not yet included another actual person. These avoidances are not random. They are specific to the decision's cost. The person who is delaying a career decision avoids contacting the person who would need to know first. The person delaying a health decision avoids making the appointment that would convert a fear into a diagnosis. The person delaying a relational decision avoids the conversation that would make the other party a participant rather than an object of the internal deliberation. The avoidance is targeted. It lands precisely on the action that would make the decision material. This targeting is worth taking seriously as evidence, but not as proof. The fact that you have avoided a specific action does not by itself confirm that the decision has been made, or that the avoided action is the correct next step. There may be legitimate reasons for the timing. There may be genuine missing information that the avoided conversation would surface before you are ready to receive it. Avoidance is a signal, not a verdict. Its value is that it identifies which step the decision is waiting at, and therefore which cost the continued thinking is protecting against. Treating avoidance as a pointing gesture rather than a confession preserves the seriousness of the inquiry. The goal at this stage is not to shame the pattern into ending, but to read it accurately. What does the avoided action require of you? What would become real if it happened? Who else would enter the process? What outcome would become harder to reverse? These questions are not rhetorical, they are diagnostic. The avoidance, examined carefully, usually indicates the exact threshold where the decision transitions from internal to consequential, and that transition is precisely where protective delay concentrates. What the avoidance reliably provides, once mapped, is a clearer picture of where the decision actually lives. Many people in prolonged delay continue researching questions that are several steps removed from the specific action they are avoiding. They are analyzing the broad landscape of a decision whose immediate next step has been identified and set aside. Moving the inquiry back to the avoided action, not to demand it but to examine what it would require, is often more productive than one more cycle of general research. Imagine the first option decided. Not announced to anyone, not acted on yet, simply decided in this moment, privately. Let the imagination settle there for a moment. Notice what happens in the body, in the breath, in the quality of attention. Then imagine the other option decided in the same way. Hold each decision separately and observe what each one produces. This is not a reliable oracle. It is a data-gathering exercise in a system where data has been difficult to isolate. The relief and the dread produced by imagined decisions are not infallible guides, but they are not meaningless either. Relief tends to arise from the option that is more aligned with something already known, a value held, a limit already reached, a conclusion the evidence has already produced. Dread tends to arise from the option whose cost feels more immediate, which is not always the same as the option that is wrong. An option that produces relief may carry serious long-term costs. An option that produces dread may be the more honest and responsible choice. Neither sensation alone determines the decision. Both sensations together tell you something about where your current working answer sits. The separation that matters here is between relief as information and relief as permission. Relief as information says, this option is more consistent with what you already know, which is worth noting. Relief as permission says this option feels better, therefore it must be correct, which is a misreading. The emotional response to an imagined decision is one reading in the index, not the final entry. A decision that produces relief from avoidance, the relief of choosing to keep things the same without examining why, carries a different quality than a decision that produces relief from clarity. Distinguishing between them requires the rest of the index. When the imagined decision is held privately and the relief is noticed, the next question is what the relief is relief from. Sometimes it is relief from an untenable situation. Sometimes it is relief from a demanding responsibility. Sometimes it is relief from having to disappoint someone. The source of the relief carries more diagnostic information than the relief itself. Recording the source, even briefly and privately before moving on, adds a data point to the working answer. Using the emotional response as data means treating it the way you would treat any other piece of evidence in the inquiry, as relevant, as partial, as requiring comparison with other evidence, and as subject to revision if new facts change its meaning. It belongs in the index. It does not control the index. The next form of behavioral evidence is the language you use when you describe the decision to yourself and others, and that language has its own diagnostic content. Pay attention to how the decision is described in casual conversation and in private thought. The phrasing tends to reveal the working answer underneath the delay. Someone whose working answer is that a relationship has reached its limit will tend to describe the situation using language that stops just short of that conclusion. Things have been difficult. The dynamic has shifted. There are conversations that need to happen. The future is uncertain. Someone whose working answer is that a professional situation is untenable will describe it as challenging, evolving, worth monitoring, not quite right. The softening is not dishonesty. It is a hedge around a conclusion that has not yet been made affordable. State the working answer without the hedge, at least privately. Not as a final verdict, not as a declaration of what will happen, but as the sentence that most accurately describes what the available evidence points toward. This is not the relationship I can remain in long term. This job is ending. This financial arrangement requires a significant change. The health symptom needs proper evaluation. Say it plainly because the plain version reveals something that the softened version conceals: the exact nature of the cost. The softened sentence postpones the cost by keeping the conclusion vague. The plain sentence makes the cost visible. The plain sentence usually produces an immediate response, and that response tends to be a form of resistance. It is too blunt. The situation is more complicated than that. The phrasing doesn't capture all the nuance. These objections may be entirely valid. The working answer at this stage is provisional, and provisional answers are appropriately refined as new evidence arrives. But there is a difference between refining a plain sentence because the evidence genuinely complicates it, and softening a plain sentence because the plain version makes the cost feel real. The first kind of revision produces a more accurate statement. The second kind produces a more bearable one. Preserving uncertainty means holding the plain working answer as the most likely current conclusion while acknowledging that likelihood is not certainty. The working answer is not a promise of what will happen. It is the best current reading of what the evidence suggests, stated without the padding that makes it temporarily more comfortable. It remains open to revision on new facts, and subject to the stop conditions and thresholds the index will establish. What it is not open to is indefinite softening in the service of indefinite postponement. The working answer, stated plainly, makes the cost visible. The cost, once visible, can be examined directly. That examination is the work of the next section, because until the cost is named and categorized, the decision remains a question about the answer rather than a question about what the answer requires. Chapter 3. The price of the answer. Name what would be lost. Not as an argument against the decision, but as an honest accounting. A person, a version of a relationship, a financial arrangement that provided security, a routine that organized daily life, a status that came with a role, a community attached to a position or a place. Loss at this scale is real before the decision is made. Acknowledging it directly does not make the decision more dangerous. What it does is remove the loss from the background, where it exerts pressure without being examined, and bring it into the open, where its actual weight can be assessed. The fact that a decision involves loss does not mean the decision is wrong. This sounds obvious when stated plainly. In practice, it is one of the more persistent confusions in prolonged delay. The grief attached to a loss is real and proportionate even when the decision producing that loss is correct. These are separate things. The grief belongs. The decision may also belong. Conflating the emotional weight of the loss with the quality of the evidence for the decision is one of the primary mechanisms by which protective delay continues past its useful life. Grief in anticipation of a real loss is not a symptom of error or weakness. It is the appropriate response to a situation in which something of genuine value is ending or changing fundamentally. Allowing the grief to be present without using it as a reason to postpone indefinitely is one of the more demanding things this index asks. It is demanding not because grief is irrational, but because grief, when it is intense enough, tends to generate its own momentum toward relief, and the most immediately available source of relief is the continued suspension of the decision. Romanticizing the loss is a different risk. This happens when the thing being lost is remembered or imagined in a form it no longer has or perhaps never fully had. The relationship remembered at its best, the role remembered at its most satisfying, the arrangement evaluated not against its current reality, but against an idealized version. The loss that should be evaluated is the loss of the situation as it actually exists, not as it existed at its peak, or as it might theoretically become under changed conditions. The cost of loss, accurately named, belongs in the index. An inflated version of the cost serves the delay. The full accounting of potential loss opens the question of what an acting decision would require socially and relationally, which is where the difficulty of conflict enters the picture. The difficult conversation anticipated in this category is usually not a single exchange, but a series of them, and the discomfort of anticipating that series is enough to sustain research for weeks. The conversation where the decision is communicated to someone who will be directly affected by it. The conversation where objections are raised and cannot all be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. The conversation that ends with disappointment, anger, or the altered terms of a relationship. These anticipated exchanges are real costs. They involve another person's genuine reaction, and that reaction cannot be researched in advance with any precision. Part of what keeps the thinking going is the implicit belief that more information will eventually produce a path through the conflict that avoids or significantly reduces the other person's distress. This belief is understandable and, in some cases, partly true. Thoughtful timing, respectful framing, and honest communication do affect how difficult conversations unfold. But no amount of additional research removes the reality that some decisions communicated honestly will produce upset in the people affected by them. The research aimed at eliminating another person's reaction to a difficult truth is research with no available endpoint. Understanding this, genuinely understanding it rather than only acknowledging it intellectually, means accepting that the desire for unanimous approval is functioning as a stop condition. The decision will not be communicated until a way is found to communicate it that produces no lasting negative response. Since that standard cannot be met for most decisions of real consequence, the thinking continues. The productive alternative is not indifference to the other person's experience. It is the planning of respectful and honest communication that acknowledges the impact without requiring the other person's agreement as a precondition for proceeding. What can be planned is the quality and honesty of the communication. The framing that respects the other person's experience rather than minimizing it. The timing that gives the other person the information they need without ambush. The willingness to hear the response without immediately defending or retreating. These are genuine preparations that a remaining period of thought can usefully produce. They are bounded. There is a point at which the communication has been planned as well as it can be planned without actually occurring. Reaching that point is a legitimate stop condition for the thinking about conflict. The category of cost that most directly threatens continued delay is not loss or conflict, but responsibility, because responsibility is the one that removes the possibility of external attribution. An answer that requires ownership is one where the decision's outcome cannot be primarily attributed to circumstances, other people's behavior or factors outside the decision-maker's control. The choice was made, the person made it. Whatever follows belongs, in a direct sense, to the person who made it. This is among the more specific costs in the index, because it forecloses certain familiar forms of subsequent narrative. The narrative in which the decision was effectively forced, the narrative in which the outcome was unforeseeable despite available evidence, the narrative in which blame can be distributed broadly enough to dilute personal accountability. Delay sometimes functions as a way of extending the period during which the decision can still be described as not yet fully made, which keeps the attribution distributed. The relationship ended not because a decision was made, but because circumstances deteriorated. The position changed not because a choice was taken, but because events unfolded. The line between genuine external causation and managed ambiguity is worth examining honestly. Both exist. The question is which one applies in the situation under current consideration. Accepting responsibility does not preclude repair. Where the working answer has caused or will cause harm to someone, acknowledging that harm and addressing it as directly as circumstances allow is part of what ownership requires. This is distinct from paralyzing guilt or compulsive self-punishment, both of which tend to substitute feeling bad for acting differently. Repair means identifying the specific harm, communicating honestly about it where appropriate, and taking whatever concrete steps are available to address it, even when those steps are incomplete. Situations of genuine complexity, legal, financial, medical or relational situations with serious and potentially irreversible consequences for others, are appropriate candidates for qualified counsel before responsibility is accepted in a formal sense. This index does not substitute for legal advice, medical consultation, or professional guidance in areas where the stakes require that expertise. Seeking that counsel is not avoidance when it is bounded by a specific question and a defined timeline. The distinction between responsible consultation and indefinite expert seeking will be developed more carefully in the chapter on legitimate delay. What the cost of responsibility establishes, alongside the costs of loss and conflict, is that identity is also implicated in many significant decisions, and identity cost is often the least examined category precisely because it operates below the level at which the thinking is conducted. Chapter 4. Identity as a hidden cost. There is a particular kind of difficulty attached to decisions that contradict something you said with confidence not long ago. A position held publicly and defended with care. A direction chosen and communicated to people whose respect matters to you. A conclusion about a person, a situation, or a life path that organized subsequent choices. When the available evidence now points away from that earlier position, the decision involves not only the practical cost of changing course, but the additional cost of having been demonstrably wrong about something important. The anticipation of being seen as contradictory produces a specific form of delay. The thinking continues, not because the earlier evidence was good and the new evidence is insufficiently clear, but because no framing has yet been found that would make the revision appear consistent rather than contradictory. Research in this mode is partially about the decision and partially about the narrative that will accompany it. The search is for a version of the changed position that can be presented as a natural evolution rather than a reversal, as additional information absorbed rather than earlier confidence abandoned. Revising a position in response to new evidence is not hypocrisy. It is the function of a mind that remains in contact with reality. The person who held a conviction and updates it when evidence changes is demonstrating competence, not weakness. The person who held a conviction and maintains it against clear counter-evidence, partly because revision would be socially costly, is doing something more concerning. Both behaviors are available to the same person. The distinction between them is internal before it is visible. Career decisions and relational decisions expose this cost with particular clarity. Someone who made a very public commitment to a professional path and now finds evidence that the path is wrong faces both the practical disruption of redirecting and the social disruption of being seen to reverse. Someone who defended a partner, a family situation, or a personal loyalty publicly, and now faces evidence that the defense was misplaced, carries both the genuine grief of revision and the additional discomfort of visible change. These costs are real. They belong in the index. They do not belong in the calculation of what the evidence actually supports. Expertise in one domain creates a particular vulnerability when a decision requires entering a domain where that expertise does not apply. A person highly accomplished in their professional field who faces a decision involving financial structures they have never had to navigate, or medical information outside their training, or legal frameworks they have never needed to understand, confronts the cost of temporary beginner status, the discomfort of not knowing things, of needing guidance from people with less general experience but more specific knowledge, of asking questions that reveal gaps. This is a cost that often goes unnamed. Identifying the specific area where beginner status applies is more useful than either denying the gap or allowing it to become a general justification for not proceeding. Competence in the decision domain can be assessed concretely. What do you actually understand about the relevant medical options, the financial implications, the legal structure? Where does genuine knowledge stop and assumption begin? These are answerable questions, and answering them honestly points toward the specific expertise that needs to be sought, rather than toward extended independent research in an area where the learning curve is real. Competence in a decision domain is different from competence as a person. A person of substantial experience and capability can genuinely lack specific expertise relevant to a particular decision without that gap reflecting on their general capacity. Treating the two as equivalent, feeling that needing a specialist's guidance in an unfamiliar area diminishes the overall claim to competence, is a conflation that delay exploits. The resolution is not pretending the expertise gap does not exist. It is finding the right qualified source, asking the bounded question, receiving the answer, and then returning to the decision. Accepting temporary learning is a form of intellectual honesty, and it is distinct from indefinite research as avoidance. A person who genuinely needs to understand a medical procedure well enough to evaluate its appropriateness, who reads carefully and asks a qualified professional precise questions and then decides, is working. A person who uses the complexity of a medical or financial situation as a permanent reason for unresolved delay is doing something different, and the difference is usually visible in whether the research is progressing toward a specific question with a bounded answer. A decision that will disappoint someone creates a particular moral weight that is distinct from both loss and conflict. The person disappointing another person is not simply causing practical inconvenience. They are in some sense failing to be what the other person needs or expected. For someone whose sense of being a good person is closely tied to consistently meeting others' needs and expectations, this kind of failure is experienced not merely as an unfortunate consequence, but as an identity-level event. The research continues, in part, because no version of the answer has been found that would allow the decision to be made without anyone experiencing genuine disappointment. This form of delay requires distinguishing between duty and compliance. There are real obligations that a good person honors, obligations to dependents, commitments made explicitly, reasonable expectations established through sustained relationship. These belong in the index, and they carry genuine weight. But there is also a kind of moral self-evaluation that conflates goodness with the condition of producing no one's disappointment, and that conflation is worth examining carefully. A person who chooses professional redirection may disappoint a mentor. A person who changes a personal commitment may disappoint someone who relied on its continuation. These disappointments are real. They are not in themselves evidence that the decision is wrong, or that the person making it is failing in a fundamental ethical sense. Examining actual duty means asking what was genuinely promised, to whom, under what conditions, and whether those conditions still hold. It means distinguishing the promise that was made from the expectation that was formed without explicit agreement. It means asking what a reasonable person in the same situation, aware of the same evidence, would consider an ongoing obligation versus a situation in which the original terms have changed enough to warrant revision. Where the decision involves potential harm to a dependent or a person in a vulnerable position, that consideration does carry specific weight and should not be resolved through the same cost framework applied to decisions without those stakes. Harm prevention is a legitimate constraint on decision-making, and it is one that this index preserves rather than flattens. Moral self-exemption, the move in which the desire to see oneself as a good person becomes a reason for not making a decision that would require honest acknowledgement of limitation, is a subtle form of the same protective pattern. Genuine ethical engagement requires accepting that honesty sometimes creates disappointment, that limits are real and must be communicated, and that doing right by the full situation occasionally means disappointing individuals within it. The index takes this seriously and does not resolve the tension by pretending it does not exist. The examination of identity costs has now prepared the ground for something more operational: the specific behavioral rituals through which delay sustains itself over weeks and months, each ritual feeling like productive work. Chapter 5. The rituals of delay. The pattern typically begins with legitimate consultation. The first advisor is appropriate, qualified, and genuinely helpful. The second brings a useful second perspective. By the third, fourth, or fifth, the purpose of the consultation has quietly shifted. The question being asked is no longer what does this person know that I do not, but rather does this person give me the answer I would prefer. When the opinion received matches what was hoped for, it is retained as evidence. When it does not, it is attributed to the advisor's incomplete understanding of the situation, and another advisor is sought. The inquiry feels responsible because it involves other people's expertise. What it is seeking is permission. Distinguishing expertise from permission is one of the cleaner diagnostic moves available at this stage. A qualified professional who has full access to the relevant facts, whose expertise directly covers the decision domain, and who provides a considered assessment, is offering something substantively different from a sympathetic conversation partner who hears a selectively framed account and offers support. Both feel valuable. Both may feel like advice. Their epistemic standing in the decision is not equivalent. When the same question has been brought to several advisors of genuine qualification and they have reached broadly similar conclusions, additional advisor consultation typically does not produce new information. It produces the same conclusions with new faces. Limiting the advisor set is not a gesture of intellectual closure, it is a decision about what the research is actually for. If the purpose is to gather qualified expertise on a specific, bounded question, the appropriate advisor pool is small, clearly qualified, and directly relevant. If the purpose is to continue the feeling of active inquiry without approaching the decision threshold, the advisor pool expands indefinitely. A useful rule at this stage is to ask, before scheduling another consultation, what specific factual or procedural question does this advisor answer that none of the previous advisors has addressed? If there is no clear answer to that question, the consultation is a delay ritual rather than a research activity, setting a specific limit, not a permanent limit on all future inquiry, but a bounded decision about how many additional qualified opinions are genuinely needed for this specific question, is a practical tool for moving through this ritual. The limit is written down before the next consultation, not after. Once the defined consultation is complete, the advisor phase closes, and the resulting information enters the cost map, rather than generating another round of advisor seeking. The pros and cons list is one of the most reliable artifacts of prolonged delay. It appears rigorous. It is systematic. It grows over time, which feels like progress. It can be shared with others as evidence of careful thinking. In many of its iterations, it contains genuinely useful information. The problem is not the list itself, but what happens to it when the weighing process produces an answer that carries a heavy cost. The list is revised. New considerations are added to the lighter side. Existing points are subdivided to create more entries. Some items are removed as less relevant. The architecture of the list is adjusted until the conclusion it supports is more bearable, or until the list becomes complicated enough that a conclusion cannot clearly be drawn from it, which also serves the delay. Incomparable values present a real problem in any cost-benefit accounting. The pleasure of remaining in a familiar city is not directly comparable to the professional opportunity in a new one. The comfort of a stable but unfulfilling relationship is not directly comparable to the difficulty of beginning again. These are genuinely different kinds of things, and any system that reduces them to the same unit of measurement introduces distortions. Acknowledging this limitation does not mean the list is useless. It means that the list must be used with the understanding that the weighting of incomparable values requires an explicit judgment call rather than a mechanical calculation. Weighting criteria means deciding, before evaluating each item, what matters most in this specific decision at this stage of life and why. Not as a general philosophical position, but as a concrete application to this choice. Once the criteria are weighted, the items on the list can be assessed in their relationship to those criteria rather than to each other directly. This is more honest than pretending that all considerations are comparable. It is also more vulnerable, because it requires committing to what you actually value, rather than preserving the appearance of balanced uncertainty. Duplicate points, once identified, should be removed from the list. The same concern appearing in three slightly different phrasings does not create three separate considerations. It creates one consideration with inflated presence. Removing duplicates does not mean dismissing the concern. It means seeing its actual weight clearly, rather than through the amplification of repetition. Once the list is deduplicated and the criteria are weighted, establishing a threshold, a point at which the balance is decisive enough to constitute a working answer, transforms the list from an open-ended exercise into a bounded one. The threshold does not need to be exact. It needs to be honest. Scenario simulation is valuable and appropriate up to a point. Working through what a decision would actually require, what the first few months would look like in practice, what specific obstacles are foreseeable, and how they might be addressed. These are legitimate preparation activities. They reduce genuine uncertainty about implementation. They also reveal practical complications that might affect the decision itself. A certain amount of scenario planning is not delay. It is diligence. The simulation becomes a ritual of delay when it shifts from planning to control. Planning accepts that the future contains genuine uncertainty and focuses on preparing for foreseeable contingencies. Control seeks a version of the future in which no negative outcome occurs. No relationship is damaged, no resource is lost, and no mistake is made. And it treats the inability to find that version as a reason to continue simulating. Since the version sought does not exist, the simulation continues indefinitely. Each new simulation finds a new complication. The decision waits for a run that comes up clean, and no run comes up clean. What can be separated out from the simulation is the planning that actually reduces risk and the rehearsal that only elaborates anxiety. Planning produces contingencies. If this specific complication arises, this is the response. Rehearsal produces scenarios. What if everything goes wrong in ways I cannot fully specify? Contingency planning has a natural endpoint because the foreseeable complications are finite. Anxiety rehearsal has no endpoint because the imagination's capacity to generate negative outcomes is effectively unlimited. Choosing a specific set of contingencies and writing them down is the bounded version of scenario planning. The question is not what could go wrong in every conceivable circumstance, but what are the 3 or 4 most probable complications, and what is a reasonable response to each. This is a completable task. When it is complete, the scenario planning phase is complete. After the contingency set is written, continuing to simulate additional scenarios serves a different function. Stopping the replay, not by suppressing anxiety, but by recognizing that the simulation has passed its useful boundary, is a legitimate and deliberate choice. The question of when more thinking is genuinely necessary rather than merely anxiety-sustaining is where the index turns next. Chapter 6. When more thinking is necessary. Some decisions are genuinely under-informed. The relevant document has not been received. The test result is pending. The conversation that would reveal another person's actual position has not happened because the timing was genuinely wrong rather than because it was avoided. These situations are real and they represent legitimate grounds for continued inquiry. The tool for identifying them is specificity. A fact capable of changing the decision's direction can be stated with some precision. Not more information in general, but this specific fact from this source expected within this window of time. Specifying the source closes the research to open-ended general accumulation. The fact needed is the pending legal opinion from the specific attorney who was consulted, not further independent reading on legal frameworks generally. The fact needed is the doctor's interpretation of the test results, not additional medical literature search. The fact needed is what the other party has decided, not further analysis of what they might decide. When the source can be named and the question can be stated precisely, the inquiry has a natural boundary. Setting a deadline for fact-gathering is not arbitrary impatience. It is the acknowledgement that most decisions are time-sensitive in ways that are not always explicit. A career decision delayed long enough affects opportunity structures that do not remain static. A relational decision extended indefinitely affects both parties in the relationship. A health decision postponed, while waiting for the perfect information environment, affects the condition being considered. The deadline defines the point at which the decision will be made on the best available information, even if the ideal information has not arrived, because the alternative, waiting until all uncertainty is resolved, is not actually available. Vague research is what happens when the question cannot be stated precisely. More reading about people who went through similar situations. More listening to accounts of decisions in broadly analogous circumstances. More general information about the domain in which the decision falls. This kind of research is not useless at the beginning of an inquiry. At a later stage, when the decision has been under consideration for a significant period, vague research typically produces a sense of continued activity without adding materially to the evidence base. The diagnostic question is not whether the reading is interesting, but whether it would change the decision if it said something different. Gathering the identified evidence from the specified source by the defined deadline is the completion of legitimate fact-gathering. What follows is a decision based on the available record, not a continued search for additional records. Legal, financial, medical, and safety decisions operate under conditions that are different from ordinary judgment calls, not because the person making them lacks intelligence or care, but because the structures involved, legal frameworks, medical protocols, financial regulations, safety requirements, carry formal complexity that requires specialist knowledge to navigate accurately. Recognizing which decisions belong in this category is itself a competence. Overclaiming it produces paralysis, since almost any consequential decision can be framed as legally or medically adjacent if the framing serves delay. Underclaiming it produces errors whose consequences fall on people who deserve the protection of proper expertise. Seeking qualified professionals in high-stakes domains means identifying the specific type of expertise required, locating a qualified practitioner, and scheduling the consultation with a defined question rather than a general request for guidance. An attorney who specializes in the relevant area of law, a physician whose practice covers the specific medical question, a financial advisor with fiduciary responsibility and direct experience with the relevant instruments. The specificity of the search is part of what determines whether it constitutes legitimate counsel or expanded delay ritual. The separation between advice and decision ownership is essential in high-stakes situations. A qualified professional's recommendation carries significant weight and should be taken seriously. It does not transfer ownership of the decision. The physician advises on the medical options and their likely outcomes. The patient decides on treatment. The attorney explains the legal implications and available strategies. The client decides on the course of action. The advisor's role is to expand the decision-maker's understanding of the actual landscape, not to bear the responsibility for what the decision-maker then chooses. Comparing recommendations becomes relevant when qualified advisors in the same domain reach different conclusions. This happens, and it is a legitimate reason for additional consultation. Specifically, consultation with another qualified professional who can help interpret the disagreement rather than simply adding a third vote. Documenting the assumptions each advisor made and the information each received ensures that the comparison is meaningful. An advisor working from incomplete or inaccurate information is not providing a genuine professional opinion. They are providing an opinion about the situation as they understand it. Once the high-stakes counsel has been gathered, the consultation phase has a defined endpoint. The questions put to qualified professionals have been answered by qualified professionals. The answers have been documented, and the decision returns to the person making it, equipped with professional expertise, but not relieved of decision ownership. There are conditions under which delay is not protective avoidance, but genuine wisdom. Exhaustion affects judgment in ways that are consistently underestimated. A person making a major decision at the end of a period of sustained stress, loss, illness, or sleep deprivation is not operating with their full evaluative capacity. The decision does not become easier because of the exhaustion, but it becomes more vulnerable to the particular distortions that exhaustion introduces. Catastrophizing, tunnel vision, susceptibility to short-term relief, and reduced capacity for long-term projection. When exhaustion is genuinely severe, brief protected delay is not avoidance. It is the preservation of decision quality. Acute crisis follows similar logic. Grief immediately following a significant loss, shock following unexpected news, or the early period after a significant betrayal all constitute conditions in which the emotional processing demands are intense enough to temporarily reduce the evaluative functions relevant to major decisions. Safe delay in these conditions means protecting against decisions made under conditions that are not representative of the person's ordinary judgment, not deferring indefinitely because the emotional situation never fully resolves. Incomplete information, as distinguished from vague research, is the third legitimate category. When a specifically required piece of information is expected and genuinely pending, not as a hypothetical future resource, but as a real document or result with an expected date, waiting for it before completing the decision is appropriate. The distinction from avoidance is the specificity of what is awaited and the definiteness of when it is expected. Protecting legitimate delay from becoming indefinite delay requires a review date. The review date is not an optimistic estimate or a gesture toward eventual resolution. It is a calendar entry at which the decision will be reconsidered with whatever information is available at that point, and a working answer will be produced regardless of remaining uncertainty. Between now and the review date, the research is bounded by the specific question awaiting a specific answer. The review date is not moved unless a clearly legitimate reason for moving it exists and is documented. Interim safeguards are relevant when the decision involves other people or ongoing situations that are affected by continued delay. When the time before the review date carries costs for others, making those costs visible and taking proportionate interim steps to limit them is part of what honest delay requires. Chapter 7. The cost map. The immediate losses that action would trigger deserve direct and unglamorous naming. If acting means leaving a position, the loss of income, title, professional community, and daily structure are real and should be written down with some specificity about their magnitude and duration. If acting means ending a relationship, the losses of shared history, practical arrangements, belonging structures, and daily companionship are real. If acting means accepting a medical intervention, the losses of time, physical comfort, Certainty about outcomes and various forms of ordinary functioning are real. Each of these requires honest accounting, not as arguments against acting, but as accurate components of the total cost of acting. Social consequences of action form a second category. The changed perceptions of people whose regard matters to you, the conversations that will follow, the relationships that may be altered or lost, the explanations that will be required and may not be received sympathetically. These consequences are frequently underestimated at the beginning of a decision process and overestimated during the period of maximum delay. Their accurate scale, neither minimized nor inflated, belongs in the cost map. The practical work of acting is often underweighted in initial cost assessments. The logistics of transition require time, energy, coordination, and often money that the current period's resources may not comfortably accommodate. The administrative, communicative, and organizational tasks involved in implementing a significant decision are rarely trivial. Including them in the cost map prevents a situation in which the decision is made, and then the implementation costs produce a second wave of resistance that is mistaken for evidence that the decision was wrong. Genuine uncertainty about outcomes is a real cost of acting. Acting on a working answer that is provisional rather than certain means accepting exposure to outcomes that were not intended and may not have been foreseeable. This is inherent to all non-trivial decisions and is not an argument against acting. It is one of the entries in the cost register. The question is not how to eliminate it, but which mitigation strategies reduce its magnitude. Mitigation of action costs is available in many decisions to some degree. Legal protections can be understood and used. Financial reserves can be established or drawn on. Support structures can be identified and engaged. Transition timelines can be sequenced to reduce simultaneous disruptions. Identifying specific mitigation strategies is the productive form of planning that reduces the cost of action without pretending the cost doesn't exist. Project ordinary continuation forward without narrative intervention. Not catastrophe, not the worst foreseeable outcome, just the continuation of the current situation at its current trajectory, because that is what not acting produces in its most direct form. The relationship continues under its present conditions. The professional situation continues in its current state. The health concern goes unaddressed for another season. The financial arrangement continues producing its current results. What does that continuation look like at 6 months, at a year? The projection is not punitive. It is the honest extension of the present. Compounding costs are what appear in that projection for most decisions that have reached the stage of prolonged delay. A health decision not made in time may alter the range of available interventions. A professional decision not made at the appropriate window may close an opportunity that does not reopen. A relational decision extended may generate secondary harms in the people involved that would not have occurred if the decision had been made earlier. A financial decision delayed may accrue costs that a timely decision would have avoided. Not all decisions compound. Some remain genuinely open for extended periods without the non-action cost growing. The question is whether this one does. Opportunity cost is distinct from compounding harm. It is the value of the alternative not taken, the professional development, relational experience, financial position, or life arrangement that becomes less available or unavailable as time continues in the current state. Opportunity cost is often invisible because it consists of things that did not happen rather than things that did, and invisible costs are easier to exclude from the accounting. Including a reasonable estimate of opportunity cost in the non-action column does not require precise calculation. It requires honest acknowledgement that the current state is also choosing, even when it feels like not choosing. Integrity cost is the effect of prolonged misalignment between what the evidence points toward and what the person's actions represent. Living in a situation whose continued existence depends on the non-action decision requires, over time, various forms of accommodation to that situation. Adjustments to how the situation is described, managed, and justified. The cumulative effect of that accommodation is a form of cost that is difficult to quantify, but that most people who have experienced it can recognize. The cost of not acting should not be inflated into guaranteed catastrophe. Most situations of genuine ambiguity are not situations where non-action produces certain ruin, and presenting them that way is its own distortion. The honest cost of not acting is the continuation of the current trajectory's actual effects, including compounding where that genuinely applies, and opportunity loss where that genuinely applies, stated without exaggeration. Both columns of the cost map are now visible. The cost of acting, with its losses, social consequences, practical demands, uncertainty, and required mitigation. The cost of not acting, with its continuation of current conditions, compounding effects, opportunity loss, and integrity friction. Neither column is empty for any decision that has reached the stage of prolonged delay. The map does not produce a cost-free path because no such path exists. The map produces something more accurate: the actual choice between two cost structures, with the option to select the one more aligned with what the evidence suggests and what the available resources can manage. What a cost-free fantasy produces is a reason for continued delay. As long as it remains possible, at least in imagination, to find a path through the decision that avoids both the cost of acting and the cost of not acting, a path where the answer is both accepted and cheap, the thinking can continue searching for it. This path does not exist for the decisions under current consideration, and recognizing that it does not exist is not pessimism. It is the factual condition of adult decision-making in situations of genuine consequence. The pain being postponed by continued delay deserves direct naming. Writing it down privately, without the hedges and phrasings that have made it more bearable. This is what accepting the working answer will cost. Not in general, not in the language of difficulty, but in the most specific terms available. The job that will end, the conversation that will happen, the relationship that will change, the certainty that will have to be given up, the identity that will have to be revised. This is the exact cost. Writing it makes it available for genuine evaluation rather than perpetual avoidance. At this point in the index, a brief exercise is worth pausing for. Write the cost attached to the most likely answer, not to announce it to anyone, not as a commitment to a particular course of action, but as an honest record for your own use. The cost is already there, whether it is named or not. Naming it privately, with as much specificity as you can manage, is the beginning of relating to the decision honestly, rather than managing it indefinitely. The working answer, stated as plainly as it can be stated at this stage, and the cost attached to it stated with equal plainness, together constitute the starting point for the threshold work that follows. The answer is provisional. Its uncertainty is preserved. What has changed is that the cost is no longer an unnamed background pressure. It is a named entry in the index available for examination. Uncertainty does not disappear after the cost is named. The working answer remains a provisional conclusion based on available evidence. What shifts is the basis for continued inquiry, from searching for an answer whose consequences are cheaper to asking what evidence threshold would legitimately change the current working answer, and what stop conditions indicate that the search has reached its productive limit. Chapter 8. The Evidence Threshold. Specifying what must be known before this decision can be made is not the same as specifying what would be desirable to know. The distinction matters because the desirable list is unlimited and the necessary list is finite. What must be known is what would change the decision if the answer were different from what is currently understood. What would be desirable to know includes context, corroboration, additional perspective, and extended certainty, all of which have value, but none of which is required for the decision to proceed at the current evidence level. What cannot be known before the decision is made is equally important to specify, because confusing unknowable information with missing information produces delay with no natural endpoint. Other people's future reactions cannot be known before the conversation occurs. The full downstream consequences of an action cannot be known before the action occurs. The exact emotional experience of living in the new situation cannot be known before the new situation is lived in. These are genuine unknowns, and they are genuine unknowns for every decision of comparable consequence. Waiting for them is not waiting for information. It is waiting for the future to announce itself in advance. Identifying acceptable risk means acknowledging that acting on a provisional conclusion involves accepting the possibility of being wrong and the possibility of outcomes that were not intended. This is not a concession that the decision is irresponsible. It is a realistic appraisal of the conditions under which adult decisions are made. Acceptable risk is calibrated to the decision's magnitude, higher for decisions that are reversible and lower for those that are not. Lower for decisions that affect other people significantly and higher for those primarily affecting the decision maker. Non-negotiables are the conditions that must be met regardless of the cost picture. Some decisions carry ethical, safety, or legal constraints that override the cost balance. A decision that would require violating a genuine legal obligation, placing a dependent at risk, or acting deceptively in ways that cause material harm to another person is constrained by those requirements before the cost map is even relevant. Identifying the non-negotiables explicitly, not to expand them into general caution, but to honor them where they genuinely apply, is part of what an honest evidence threshold requires. Where qualified counsel is part of the legitimate research identified earlier, confirming that the available professional guidance has been gathered and integrated is part of closing the threshold definition. The threshold is not met until the specific expert questions that were identified have received answers from the specified sources. An if-then decision rule converts the evidence threshold into an actionable condition. If the legal opinion confirms that this action is within the available protections, then the decision proceeds on that path. If the medical consultation confirms that the risk profile is within the stated acceptable range, then the treatment decision is made on those grounds. If the conversation with the other person reveals that the concern you were attributing to their likely position is in fact not their position, then the decision is revised accordingly. The rule is written before the final evidence is gathered, not after, because writing it after allows the result to be reinterpreted in light of what was hoped for, rather than what was specified. Mood-based revision of the decision rule is the primary threat to its integrity. The rule is clear on a day when the cost feels manageable. On a day when the cost feels overwhelming, the rule seems insufficient, the evidence seems less clear than it did, and a new round of inquiry feels necessary. Recognizing this pattern as mood-based, rather than evidence-based, is one of the more challenging requirements of the threshold system, because the mood genuinely affects how the evidence appears. The practical protection against mood-based revision is committing the decision rule to writing before the emotionally difficult days, rather than consulting it only when the emotional weather is favorable. Career decisions and relational decisions illustrate the decision rule most concretely. In a career situation, if the consultation with the advisor in the target field confirms that the transition is viable given the specific experience held, and if the financial reserve calculation shows that 12 months of reduced income is survivable with current assets, then the formal notice is given within 30 days of receiving both confirmations. In a relational situation, if the direct conversation confirms that the concern cannot be addressed within the existing terms of the relationship, then the decision to end the relationship is executed within the agreed timeframe. The specificity is not precision for its own sake. It is the protection of the rule against the indefinite postponement that vague criteria allow. Safety considerations constitute an override provision in the decision rule. When the evidence gathered reveals that the decision involves a safety risk for any party, the decision maker, a dependent, a vulnerable person involved in the situation, the safety consideration is not balanced against other cost categories. It is addressed first, potentially with the involvement of the appropriate qualified professionals or services. The decision rule does not replace safety assessment. Setting a deadline as part of the decision rule means specifying the date by which the working answer becomes the acted-on answer, assuming no new fact of the type that would change the decision has emerged. The deadline is not a pressure tactic. It is a recognition that time is itself a resource being spent by the delay, and that spending it without defined limit is a decision that deserves to be made consciously. Committing to the evidence standard, the agreement that the decision rule will be honored when its conditions are met, even if the emotional experience on that day is not one of confident clarity, is what separates the threshold from another version of the list. The threshold is met, and the decision follows. That commitment is worth making explicitly, even if only to oneself. A provisional conclusion is a working answer based on the best currently available evidence, held with the explicit acknowledgement that new evidence meeting specific criteria could revise it. It is provisional in the sense of being evidence-dependent, not in the sense of being uncertain to the point of inaction. The distinction is between an answer held open, because more evidence might genuinely change it, and an answer held open, because holding it open is more comfortable than acting on it. Both feel like open questions. Only one is. Separating a provisional conclusion from indecision means recognizing that the conclusion has been reached, that the evidence currently available, weighed honestly, points in a specific direction, and that the provisionality describes the conditions of revision rather than the absence of a conclusion. A surgeon who says this procedure is the recommended course of action based on the current findings and will be reassessed if new imaging changes the picture is not being indecisive. The provisional conclusion is what makes responsible action possible in conditions where certainty is not fully available. Revision on new facts means exactly that. Revision based on facts that were not available at the time the working answer was formed, that meet the criteria for relevance established by the evidence threshold, and that materially alter the decision calculus. A test result that changes the medical picture, a document that changes the legal standing, a statement by the other party that changes the relational assessment. These are legitimate grounds for revision. Revision driven by repeated fear alone is a different category. The working answer was reached, the cost was named, and then anxiety about the cost generated a new round of questioning in which the same evidence was reviewed and found to be less convincing than it had been. The evidence has not changed. The fear has intensified. Allowing fear to function as a reason for reopening a working answer that was reached on evidence turns the threshold into something that can always be undone by the next difficult emotional period, which means it was never really a threshold. Review criteria are the conditions under which genuine revision of the working answer is appropriate. Writing them down before the working answer is acted on gives revision its proper structure. It happens when these specific conditions are met, not when the emotional experience of the cost becomes acute. The review criteria are not a list of everything that could theoretically change. They are the specific bounded conditions that the working answer explicitly depends on. Accepting incomplete certainty is not resignation. It is the honest acknowledgement that the certainty available to human decisions in complex adult situations is partial certainty, and that partial certainty, when it is sufficient by the standards established through the threshold exercise, is enough to support proportionate action. The alternative, requiring complete certainty before acting, is a standard that no consequential decision actually meets, which makes it the most reliable engine of indefinite delay. Chapter 9. Reversible and irreversible. Before the full decision is implemented, many decision paths contain smaller steps that can be taken without committing to the final outcome. These testable steps gather real evidence from actual exposure rather than from further simulation. The person considering a professional change can have a direct conversation with someone in the target role, not as a social courtesy, but as a structured information-gathering exercise before any formal steps are taken. The person reconsidering a relational arrangement can clearly communicate a specific concern and observe the actual response before deciding whether the decision to change the arrangement is warranted. The evidence produced by testable steps is qualitatively different from the evidence produced by additional analysis because it comes from reality rather than from modeling. What a testable step produces is not a rehearsal of the decision, but a real data point about its conditions. The difference is that a rehearsal occurs entirely in the decision-maker's mind and can produce any result the mind is inclined toward, while a testable step occurs in contact with another person, an institution, or a real situation, and produces a result that cannot be retrospectively adjusted. This is precisely why testable steps are sometimes avoided in the same pattern as the other avoided actions identified earlier. They would produce real information rather than controllable analysis. Protecting the ethics of testable steps means ensuring that the step itself is honest. A testable step that requires deceiving another person about its purpose, using someone's response to make a decision about them without their knowledge that they are being evaluated, or creating a situation that harms someone in order to observe their reaction, is not a legitimate research tool. The information gathered through an ethically compromised testable step is unreliable, in addition to being harmful. Testable steps are bounded by the same ethical requirements as the eventual decision. When testable steps have produced their evidence, that evidence enters the cost map and the threshold system rather than generating another set of testable steps. There is a natural limit to preliminary research, and that limit is reached when the evidence from preliminary steps is sufficient to evaluate the main decision by the established threshold criteria. Some elements of a decision are not testable in advance. Once certain actions are taken, the situation changes in ways that cannot be fully undone. A formal legal action, once initiated, changes the legal relationship between the parties regardless of what happens afterward. A medical procedure once performed has occurred regardless of how the recovery proceeds. A public announcement once made has been received regardless of subsequent corrections. A formal professional resignation once submitted has been made regardless of subsequent negotiations. These are points of no return, and they deserve a different quality of attention than reversible preliminary steps. Identifying the irreversible elements of a decision before acting on any element allows the sequence to be managed rather than discovered after the fact. The irreversible elements should receive the greatest scrutiny, the most careful consideration of the available evidence, and where applicable, the most thorough professional counsel. Slowing down appropriately at these points is not delay in the protective sense. It is proportionate care for consequential actions. Safeguards at irreversible junctures take several forms: legal documentation of what is being agreed to and under what conditions, medical second opinions when the intervention is significant and non-urgent, financial review by a qualified fiduciary when the commitment involves resources that cannot be recovered, explicit communication with the people most directly affected by the irreversible element before it occurs rather than after. These safeguards do not prevent the action. They ensure that the action occurs with full clarity about what it involves and what it commits to. Beginning with reversible actions allows the decision process to gather real evidence while maintaining the greatest possible flexibility. The sequence starts with the steps that provide information without foreclosing options, the conversation that clarifies the landscape without committing to an outcome, the preliminary legal or financial consultation that maps the terrain without initiating formal proceedings, the initial professional contact that establishes possibilities without creating obligations. These early steps produce evidence that belongs in the threshold evaluation. Reviewing the evidence produced by early steps before proceeding to less reversible ones is not hesitation. It is the deliberate architecture of a sequenced decision. The question at each review point is whether the evidence gathered by the current step has changed the threshold assessment or confirmed it. If confirmed, the sequence continues to the next step. If materially altered by new facts, the threshold is genuinely reopened using the revision criteria that were established in advance. Communicating with the people who will be significantly affected before the irreversible elements of the decision are executed belongs in most decision sequences of consequence. The communication does not require their approval as a precondition. It requires their awareness as a matter of respect and honest dealing. There are situations in which the sequence of communication is genuinely constrained. Legal situations, safety situations, situations where premature disclosure would cause harm rather than prevent it. These are genuine exceptions. They are not a general license to treat the affected parties as recipients of a fait accompli. Crossing the irreversible threshold deliberately means doing so with full awareness of what it is and what it commits to, having sequenced the reversible steps appropriately, and gathered the evidence they produced, with the working answer confirmed by the threshold criteria and the cost named and acknowledged. The threshold is crossed because the evidence supports it, not because the delay has become intolerable or because emotional pressure from any direction has made a decision feel urgent regardless of the evidence. Once crossed, the decision is in the domain of implementation and repair rather than further deliberation. That transition requires knowing when the research has genuinely ended. Chapter 10. The stop conditions. The clearest signal that research has reached its productive boundary is the repetition of categories rather than the emergence of new ones. Each new source consulted covers ground that previous sources already covered. Each new account of a similar situation reveals the same considerations in a different order. Each new conversation with a knowledgeable person recirculates the same types of concerns, the same types of opportunities, and the same types of risks that were present in the research from 2 weeks ago. The information is arriving in new containers. The categories of information have stopped expanding. Noticing repetition requires an honest comparison of recent research with earlier research. Not a feeling that the research is reaching completion. That feeling is available at any stage, when the weight of continued inquiry becomes burdensome. But an actual review of what the most recent sources have added in terms of categories, considerations, or facts not previously available. If the review reveals that recent research is primarily elaborating or corroborating categories already present in the earlier research base, the research has reached saturation in those categories. Saturated research does not mean complete knowledge. It means that the current research methods and current sources have provided what they are capable of providing within the bounds of the defined question. Archiving the sources, recording what was reviewed, what it contained, and how it was weighed, preserves the record without requiring continued review. The archive is available for consultation if genuinely new information later requires reassessment. What it is not is a reason to continue reviewing the same material in search of a different conclusion. When the sources are saturated, continuing to seek advisors who draw on the same sources produces the same kind of saturation in advisor input. At that point, the stop condition applies to advisor consultation as well. No new category of consideration is being introduced, which is the marker that the consultation phase has reached its natural end. Compare the concerns generated in the most recent research period with the concerns generated in the research that preceded it. The comparison is specific. Have the recent sessions produced consequences, risks, or implications that were genuinely absent from the earlier research? Or have they produced the same consequences in more elaborate form, with greater emotional intensity, or more detailed scenarios, but without materially expanding what is at stake? The distinction between emotional intensity and novelty is critical at this stage and is consistently underestimated. A fear that has been present throughout the research period does not become more valid as a research prompt merely because it has become more vivid or more persistent. The intensification of an existing fear is an emotional event, not a new piece of evidence. Its appropriate address is within the cost map and the threshold exercise, not through a new cycle of research aimed at resolving it. Confirming the threshold means returning to the evidence threshold established in the previous work and asking whether the recent research has added anything that changes it. If the threshold has not been altered by what the recent research produced, if the conditions defined for a working answer remain satisfied by the same evidence that satisfied them before the recent research began, then the recent research has confirmed the threshold rather than reopening it. Confirmation is a stop condition. It is not evidence that the threshold was wrong. When both the category saturation and the consequence review confirm that the recent research has not expanded the evidence base in a materially relevant direction, the remaining question is whether the decision date has been set and honored. An open research process without a defined endpoint perpetuates itself by its own motion. The research continues because it has always continued, and because stopping it requires a deliberate act of closure that delay, by its nature, continues to defer. Setting a date means specifying the calendar day on which the working answer becomes the acted-on answer, not a general intention, not a vague time frame, not a range, a specific date written in a context where it functions as a real commitment rather than a private aspiration. The decision date is derived from the time required for the remaining defined tasks, gathering the specific outstanding evidence, completing any defined testable steps, conducting the final review of the threshold criteria. The date is set to allow that work to be completed without padding. Defining remaining tasks prevents the decision date from being set artificially with no operational anchor. The remaining tasks are the specific bounded activities identified by the threshold exercise, the final professional consultation, the completion of the testable preliminary step, the document that is awaited and expected. If no remaining tasks can be identified, if the current state of the evidence already meets the threshold criteria and the stop conditions have been triggered, the decision date is now or within a few days, not a future point justified by work that has not been defined. Preventing new arbitrary research between the current date and the decision date requires a clear policy applied to oneself honestly about what constitutes a legitimate exception. A genuinely new piece of information that arrives through a channel that was part of the defined research plan and that falls within the categories of facts capable of changing the decision is a legitimate exception. A new article encountered by accident, a new account heard in a social context, a new anxiety-driven search session at 11 in the evening. These are not legitimate exceptions, and treating them as such would extend the decision date indefinitely, which is what they are designed to do. Safety exceptions are real and they override the decision date. If genuinely new safety information arrives, information that changes the risk profile of the decision in a material way for the decision maker or for someone significantly affected, the decision date pauses and the safety information is evaluated by the threshold criteria before proceeding. This exception is bounded. It applies to safety information, and it results in a new decision date set after the safety evaluation is complete, not in the return to open-ended research. Chapter 11. Act before confidence. The first action after the decision date is not the most dramatic one available. It is a proportionate, observable step that moves the decision from internal to actual without requiring the full implementation sequence to begin simultaneously. Proportionate means sized to what the evidence currently supports and to what the decision sequence's current stage requires. It is the conversation that communicates the decision to the person who needs to know first, or the document that initiates the formal process, or the appointment that makes the next stage concrete. It is not the complete resolution of the situation in a single action. Observable means that the step can be verified by the decision maker and by the situation as having occurred. The step was taken. Something changed as a result. That change is now part of reality rather than part of planning. Observable steps produce feedback that planning does not, and the feedback, even when it is difficult, is more useful than another cycle of pre-action analysis. Observation is how the index learns from reality rather than from itself. Theatrical gestures are the opposite of proportionate observable steps. The gesture that announces the decision publicly before the direct communication has happened. The dramatic action that performs resolution rather than enacting it. The irreversible move made as a way of committing to the decision before the sequence has warranted it. These tend to be driven by the same avoidance structure as the delay. Not a desire to postpone the cost, but a desire to perform resolution in a way that skips past it. Both extremes, endless delay and dramatic acceleration, serve the same function. They prevent the decision from being made deliberately, with the cost fully acknowledged and the sequence honored. Recording the reason for the first step, briefly, for private use, creates an accountable record that can be consulted if the implementation period becomes difficult. The reason is not an elaborate justification. It is the plain statement of what the evidence supported and what the threshold established. This record is not a defense against regret. It is a referent that allows later a clear distinction between reconsidering the decision because new facts have emerged and reconsidering it because the emotional experience of the cost has become acute. Fear, grief, and doubt are normal accompaniments to consequential decisions, including correct ones. The presence of these states after a decision has been implemented does not indicate that the decision was wrong. It indicates that the decision involved real costs that are now being experienced, rather than anticipated, which is what cost in reality feels like compared to cost in analysis. This is worth stating plainly because the implementation period is the point at which protective delay, having been overcome, can reassert itself in a new form, the reinterpretation of normal post-decision discomfort as evidence of error. The pull to immediately reinterpret the decision when the first difficulties appear is strong and understandable. The discomfort is real. The cost is now actual rather than projected. Some element of the implementation has not gone exactly as anticipated. In this environment, the mind can find in the same evidence that supported the working answer new readings that suggest the decision was premature or wrong. These readings should be examined, not dismissed, but examined with the threshold criteria and the stop conditions in place, not with the open-ended inquiry that characterizes the pre-decision research period. Using support during the implementation period is legitimate and different from the advisor seeking of the delay ritual. A trusted person who knows the full context of the decision and can help the decision-maker distinguish genuine new evidence from emotional reactivity to the cost is genuinely useful. The distinction is between support for navigating a decision already made and consultation in service of reopening a decision that the evidence supported. The first belongs in the implementation period. The second requires the threshold criteria to be met before it is acted on. After the first step has been taken and a reasonable period of time has elapsed, gathering the actual evidence produced by the action is the work of this stage. Not evidence sought through continued analysis, but evidence produced by what has actually happened, the response of the other party to the communication, the practical consequences that have or have not materialized, the experience of operating in the changed situation. This evidence is qualitatively superior to pre-action analysis because it comes from contact with the actual conditions rather than from modeling them. Comparing what was predicted with what has occurred is the most honest form of post-decision evaluation, not to assign blame for wrong predictions, but to assess the quality of the original analysis and to identify where the working answer's assumptions were confirmed or where they require adjustment. A prediction that a relationship's practical restructuring would produce conflict and that the conflict would subside over time is either being borne out or not. A prediction that a professional change would produce initial difficulty and eventual improvement is either tracking as expected or deviating in a direction that carries information. The comparison is factual rather than evaluative. Adjusting implementation based on actual evidence is different from reversing the decision. Most significant decisions require implementation adjustments as reality provides feedback that planning could not fully anticipate. The adjustment does not reopen the core decision. It refines how the decision is being executed in light of actual conditions. This distinction between adjusting implementation and reopening the decision itself is maintained by the threshold criteria. The core decision is reopened only if the actual evidence meets the revision criteria established when the working answer was formed. Preserving accountability in the post-action period means honoring the commitments made as part of the decision sequence, the communication that was promised, the timeline that was established, the obligations to others that were part of the decision's terms. Post-action accountability is part of what the decision's integrity consists of. It is also part of what makes the next decision more honest, because a record of having honored the first decision's commitments is part of the evidence base on which subsequent decisions draw. Final chapter. After the answer, grief over what was lost through the decision is appropriate, real and sometimes lasting. It is not the same thing as the conclusion that the decision was wrong. The distinction between these two states is clear in principle and persistently difficult in practice, because grief produces a kind of gravity that makes the world of the pre-decision feel more available than it was, and the world of the post-decision feel less hospitable than it may become. The grief is about the actual loss. The evaluation of the decision belongs to a different inquiry, conducted with the original evidence rather than with the emotional weight of the cost being felt. Reviewing the original evidence means returning, not compulsively, but deliberately, to the record of what the decision was based on. The threshold criteria, the cost map, the working answer as it was stated before being acted on. The question is whether that evidence, in light of what has subsequently occurred, still supports the conclusion that was reached. This is not a retrospective justification exercise. It is a genuine evaluation. Given what was known at the time the decision was made, was the decision reasonable? If yes, the grief belongs to the decision and the decision remains defensible. If no, if the original evidence was misread in a way that a more careful analysis would have caught, that is different information that should be integrated into how future decisions are approached. New facts that have emerged since the decision are genuine grounds for evaluation and potentially for adjustment of implementation. The fact that arrives after the decision that changes something material about the situation is not a proof of error. Decisions are made with available evidence, and new evidence arriving afterward is not a failure of the original analysis. What it may be is a reason to adjust how the decision is being implemented, or in rare cases where the irreversible threshold has not yet been crossed, a reason to apply the revision criteria. Compulsive reopening of a decided question, returning to it repeatedly, not because new facts have arrived, but because the grief and discomfort of the cost are producing strong pressure for relief, is one of the more exhausting patterns that can follow a difficult decision. It is exhausting because it applies the full weight of the decision process to a situation that is no longer in the pre-decision stage, and because the relief it seeks, a version of the past in which the decision was not made, is definitionally unavailable. Recognizing this pattern for what it is does not eliminate the grief. It locates the grief correctly, as belonging to the cost of the decision rather than incorrectly, as evidence that the decision can still be undone. Naming the harm that the decision has caused, where harm has occurred, is the beginning of repair. The harm to a person who was dependent on the situation that the decision changed, the harm to a relationship that the decision altered or ended, the practical harm to someone whose arrangements were disrupted. Naming harm is not self-punishment. It is accuracy, and accuracy about harm is what makes repair possible, as opposed to what makes apology possible. These are different things. Communicating clearly about the harm means speaking to the people affected in ways that acknowledge the impact without performing contrition as a substitute for addressing it. The communication is honest, specific, and calibrated to what the other person actually needs to hear, which is not always the same as what would make the decision maker feel better about the cost. Clear communication about harm acknowledges what occurred without attributing it entirely to external circumstances, without minimizing its real effects on the other person, and without seeking immediate forgiveness as a condition of the communication. Fulfilling obligations that remain in effect despite the decision honors the legitimate commitments that the decision did not dissolve. A decision to change a professional role does not dissolve the obligations of the role during the transition. A decision to end a relationship does not dissolve financial, parental, or other legal obligations that existed independently. Identifying which obligations persist and honoring them specifically is part of what decision ownership requires in practice. Accepting limits means recognizing that not all harm caused by a decision can be repaired through subsequent action. Some disruptions to other people's lives produce effects that continue beyond what the decision maker can address. Some relationships changed by the decision cannot be returned to their previous form, even if both parties would prefer that outcome. Some losses are not recoverable through effort, communication, or goodwill. Accepting these limits is not abandonment. It is honest acknowledgement that repair operates within real constraints and that the obligation is to do what is genuinely possible rather than to achieve outcomes that are not available. Decision competence, as this index has defined it throughout, is not the capacity to act without doubt, to be consistently right, or to avoid difficult costs. It is the capacity to reach a working answer based on available evidence, to name the cost attached to that answer honestly, to apply defined stop conditions to the research process, and to take proportionate action before certainty is complete. That is the entire competence. It is bounded, realistic, and available to any person willing to use its tools honestly. Humility belongs in this competence as a structural feature rather than as a character quality attached to certain personalities. A person who has made decisions using a genuine threshold system, named costs accurately, and taken proportionate action has also produced an honest record of where the analysis was correct and where it was not. That record, used without self-punishment, is the material from which the threshold criteria improve over time. Humility is the willingness to consult that record rather than to revise the memory of the original analysis in light of what actually occurred. Learning from outcomes means specifically comparing what the working answer predicted with what reality produced, identifying the type of error where error occurred, and updating the threshold criteria accordingly. The threshold for evidence in a domain where previous working answers have been consistently well calibrated can be held with somewhat more confidence. The threshold in a domain where previous working answers have been consistently over-optimistic should be revised to require more evidence or more qualified counsel before acting. This is how the index improves. It does not improve by becoming more cautious in general. It improves by becoming more accurately calibrated to the specific domains and conditions where the previous analysis was most vulnerable. Updating the decision rules in light of what outcomes reveal is the practice that converts experience into competence rather than merely converting it into history. The rules are not rewritten to confirm that previous decisions were correct. They are revised to reflect what the outcomes have actually taught about the quality of the analysis. This revision is done when the outcomes are sufficiently clear to support it, not during the acute period of discomfort, and not compulsively whenever a difficult moment arises, but deliberately at a point when the evidence from the outcome is genuinely available. And then there is a return to the opening image. The tabs still open on another screen, another decision forming, another list of considerations accumulating. The difference now is that the index is available. The research will not continue indefinitely. The cost will be named. The threshold will be set. The stop conditions will be applied. The first proportionate step will be taken before the certainty that was never coming has had time to be missed. Epilogue. Close the index. Come back to the beginning of this. The tabs. The list rewritten for the third time. The sense of genuine effort that has not yet produced movement. The answer that was forming in the evidence before the research even reached its current volume. What the index has produced, across all of its chapters, is not a new answer. In most cases, it is a clearer account of the answer that was already there, and a clearer account of the cost that kept the answer from being stated plainly. State the working answer plainly now, with the cost beside it, in whatever private way is available. Not as a public declaration, not as a performance of resolution, but as an honest sentence. This is the most likely answer, and this is what it costs. Those two things together constitute the actual decision rather than the indefinitely extended inquiry about it. The sentence does not require complete confidence. It requires only that the evidence threshold has been met and the stop conditions have been triggered, which the work of this index was designed to establish. The first proportionate step follows from the sentence. The step is specific, bounded, observable, and sequenced appropriately within the reversibility framework. It is not the full resolution of the situation. It is the movement from the state of holding the decision to the state of acting on it. The master loop, held open since the beginning of this index, closes here. The distinction between thinking that produces clarity and thinking that protects against cost is now operational. The clarity was sufficient. The cost was named. The loop closes not in certainty but in movement. Knowing in the sense this index has used throughout means having gathered sufficient evidence by a defined threshold, having named the cost honestly, having applied the stop conditions to the research, and having reached a working answer that is more supported by the available evidence than any alternative currently under consideration. It does not mean having eliminated all uncertainty. It does not mean having resolved all objections. It does not mean having received confirmation from a source that carries authority beyond the evidence itself. The working answer remains open to revision on new facts. That openness is permanent and genuine, not a formality. If a fact arrives that falls within the revision criteria, a fact that was genuinely unavailable at the time the threshold was set, that belongs to the categories of information capable of changing the decision. The revision criteria are applied and the working answer is reconsidered. This is not inconsistency. It is the accurate behavior of a conclusion that was always based on evidence rather than on certainty. What fear cannot do within this framework is demand the certainty that human decisions do not offer as a condition of proceeding. The demand for certainty beyond the evidence threshold is not a rigorous epistemic standard. It is the delay's final defense, dressed in the language of intellectual caution. Recognizing it as such does not make the fear disappear. It removes the fear's capacity to function as a permanent veto over a working answer that the evidence has already established. If you have worked through this index honestly, there is a cost attached to the answer you have been researching. Not a general sense of difficulty, the specific thing this answer requires you to accept, give up, begin, end, communicate, or become. If you are willing to name it here, write it where you can see it. Not for anyone else to evaluate, not as a confession, but as the honest private record that the index was built to produce. The cost is already real, whether it is named or not. Naming it is the beginning of deciding rather than researching. The question this index was not designed to answer is the one that follows from the decision itself. What do you do about the people who are no longer present in the situation, but who continue to vote on it? The ones whose expectations, judgments, histories, and imagined reactions still occupy space in the deliberation, even though they left or were left years ago. That question belongs to a different record, and that record opens where this one ends.